Welcome back to Morning After. Thank you for joining us, everyone. I'm Ron Corning. It is 10:14 here on this Thursday morning. And boy, what's happened in the last couple of weeks when it comes to social media platforms and conversations around the internet and what constitutes free speech is really going to be a conversation I think will continue for some time. We want to delve into some of the issues surrounding this. Adam Rizzieri is joining us, co-founder of Agency Partner Interactive. Good to see you, Adam. Thanks for being here.
Pleasure to be here. Good morning.
I want to start in a way with sort of the elementary building blocks of the internet and this idea that people might have had that it's this vast web of information and it's at times not moderated, and that's okay. We've seen that there are steps that can be taken to begin moderating and shutting down some voices. Where do you stand on that, and what does it mean?
So the internet really has become a public forum, and it is interesting to kind of see how this public forum is kind of deciding which conversations to dial up from a volume perspective and which conversations to dial down. When I look at just kind of what makes up the internet, you know, you've got Amazon, one of the biggest hosting providers in the world. They have a very dominant market share when it comes to supporting the websites and the platforms that facilitate these conversations. And so when I think about kind of what the internet is and what it's become, you know, is it a utility at this point? What kind of value is the internet offering our personal lives and our businesses on a daily basis? And really, are we at a point now where we have to sort of kind of look at what the infrastructure of the internet is, which I think you could argue that the hosting side of things really is kind of more of a utility sort of service, but then all those platforms that exist on top of it, sharing information, sharing conversations, just how free is that exchange of information? We're getting to a point now where we've actually seen a lot of the tech leaders start to make decisions that I think in a lot of cases should be left for elected officials.
Well, Jack Dorsey is among them. I mean, he banned the president from Twitter, and he said yesterday he wasn't happy to do it. He didn't want to do it, but he felt he had an obligation to do it because of what happened at the Capitol. He believed his platform had been used to inform people to gather and then carry out these acts. That's where he stands on that. At the same time, he said they need to do a better job of shutting down other things that are happening on his site. We know that there are any number of accounts on there that are promoting and talking about, and there could be a case to be made lead to sex trafficking, for example. So how do you reconcile those two things?
How do you reconcile the fact that you have the Ayatollah trying to, you know, encourage genocide in multiple languages on the Twitter platform, right? There's so much stuff that happens on social media and on Twitter that it's, I think, very difficult for Jack Dorsey to make an argument that he was taking the high ground in this position, because there have been plenty of situations in the past that Twitter's kind of had a hands-off sort of policy, you know, in respect of stifling conversation that does promote violence, that maybe is defamation, and really the kind of conversations that shouldn't take place in a public forum.
Well, what about this? I mean, I've said this for a long time. So Facebook comes around, and it appears to be a place for people to reconnect, people they've lost touch with, a place to post pictures of your newborn, your family reunion, what's happening in your life. But let's be honest, it's really become a news aggregate site, and it has been that for a very long time. There were conversations in 2012 about President Obama being a Muslim, and we know that's not true. And all of that misinformation was shared on Facebook from sites and sources that weren't vetted as real bastions of journalism. So give me some sense of, Mark Zuckerberg appears to be leaning toward taking that role more seriously as a news aggregate site. But at what point does Facebook become recognized and regulated in the same way that the FCC regulates broadcast networks and cable from what they can put out?
It's hard to say, right? It's really hard to say, but I think in some ways that's really kind of a decision that has to be left to the conversation around Section 230. There's a lot of voices that say repeal Section 230 and make these social platforms totally responsible for whatever third-party data or news might exist on their sites.
Wouldn't they be?
Wouldn't
they be put out of business though? I mean, if 230, if they were, so for people who don't know, 230 protects Twitter, Facebook, and others from not being legally responsible for things that are posted on their site that might lead to acts of violence. Is that correct?
That's exactly right. So I think that the argument is don't repeal Section 230, reform it, and make sure that you hold social media platforms to the same standard that you would hold anybody to when they're in a public forum. You know, you can't be engaging in defamation. You cannot be encouraging acts of physical violence or harm. And ultimately, you cannot be using extreme profanity. I think that the basic standard that we set for ourselves in a public forum should apply to social media platforms. Now, with that being said, there is no consistency in how these policies are being policed, right?
Mm-hmm.
You see so much inconsistency, and that's why you see people, you know, kind of rising up and complaining about this. The social media platforms need to have some consistency in how they actually go about enforcing their terms of service, and really also just kind of living by the law. When they choose to start moderating conversations, but doing so really leveraging their own kind of perspective, whether it's a political bias or just something that might sort of influence a decision that maybe is in the gray, right? They have to have some consistency in how they're doing this. Otherwise, you're not going to have a fair conversation. I would argue that one of the great things about our country is the fact that we are diverse and that we are free thinkers, right? And if all of a sudden we know that our social platforms are making decisions about which content we should have access to and which content we should not have access to, then, you know, as an American public, we have to start questioning the authenticity of what we're seeing, right? And that's a big problem when it comes to the news being the news and reporting on events that are real and that matter.
Oh, please. You're telling us. We know. We have to combat misinformation all the time. In the meantime, you'd never know this is such a hot button topic based on the video we're showing. People are in parks, smiling with their kids on their iPads and drinking their coffee and checking their Twitter feed. You know, the good old days, the good old days. Adam, thank you for joining us. Adam Rizzieri is co-founder of Agency Partner Interactive. We appreciate your perspective, some really interesting stuff there, and you can check out Agency Partner at agencypartner.com. They're also on Instagram.